When war comes, it takes more than soldiers. It takes futures. It takes sons. And for every soldier lost, there is a mother left behind, carrying a weight that medals and monuments can never repay. They're called the Gold Star Mothers. Women who've received the telegram that no parent ever wants to read. We regret to inform you. These mothers did not march in formations or storm the beaches. They stayed home, waited, hoped, and prayed. And when hope turned into heartbreak, they bore that grief with dignity and grace the world rarely saw.
He was only 19, barely a man. I still remember the last thing he said to me. "I'll be back before the leaves turn." That fall, I stood by the window every day, waiting, but the only thing that returned was a folded flag.
They kept writing letters long after their sons were gone, sending words into the void, because sometimes grief has no place to go. Some turned their sorrow into service, volunteering at hospitals, organizing support groups, or advocating for veterans' rights. They transformed their mourning into a mission. These women did not ask to be part of history, but history etched itself onto their hearts, and still they rose, quiet heroes of the home front, symbols of strength that no statue could capture. In the face of unimaginable loss, these mothers became keepers of memory, guardians of stories that could have faded into silence. They remind us that war doesn't just happen in the trenches or skies. It happens in the homes left hollow, the chairs left empty, and the futures rewritten. This is not just a story of war. It's a story of love, loss, and the unyielding strength of those who endure the silence after the last shot is fired. When World War II ignited a global firestorm, America was called to arms. But as millions of men left for the battlefront, it wasn't just soldiers who answered the call. At home, an army of women rolled up their sleeves and stepped into the factories, forges, and shipyards. They weren't soldiers, but they were warriors in their own right. They were the Rosies and the Riveters. These women weren't just assembling weapons or welding steel. They were building the backbone of the Allied war effort. From the heart of Detroit to the shipyards of San Francisco, women filled jobs once considered men's work. They built bombers, tanks, and warships, breaking barriers with every shift. Rosie the Riveter was more than just a poster girl. She was a symbol of strength, grit, and patriotism. But behind the symbol were millions of real women. Housewives, students, teachers, farm girls. Many had never held a wrench before, let alone riveted a warplane. But they trained fast and worked harder. They learned to read blueprints, operate heavy machinery, and assemble aircraft with stunning precision. By 1943, nearly 3 million women were working in defense industries. Black women, long excluded from many skilled positions, began to break through racial barriers in war industries. Native American, Latina, and Asian American women also joined the workforce, each pushing past gender and cultural boundaries to serve the nation. But life on the factory floor wasn't easy. The hours were long. The conditions were dangerous. Many juggled childcare, rationing, and endless work weeks. Yet despite the hardships, these women formed bonds of solidarity. They took pride in their work, in their country, and in each other. When the war ended in 1945, many Rosies were asked or forced to return to their homes. Their jobs were given back to returning servicemen. The assembly lines grew quiet, but something had changed. These women had proven themselves. They had reshaped what it meant to be capable, to be essential, to be a woman in America. Their legacy lives on not just in museums or history books, but in every woman who knows her worth, demands her place, and says without hesitation, "I can do it too." In times of war, resistance doesn't always come from the battlefield. Sometimes the fiercest warriors are those who speak, who write, who march, not with rifles, but with conviction. This is the story of the women who dared to dissent, who challenged the draft, questioned authority, and raised their voices against the machine of war. These were the voices of resistance. During the Vietnam War, the draft tore through families and communities. While most of the resistance was led by men dodging conscription or burning draft cards, a growing chorus of women began to rise. They weren't drafted, but they were deeply affected. Their brothers, boyfriends, sons, and students were sent to fight a war many believed was unjust. And so, they fought back in their own way. These women organized sit-ins at draft offices, created underground newsletters, and hosted teach-ins at universities across the country. They formed support networks for draft resistors and exposed the racial and class inequalities that riddled the selective service system. But their resistance wasn't just about the draft. It was about a broader moral outcry. These women questioned why a country that claimed to fight for freedom abroad allowed oppression, segregation, and injustice at home. One such voice was Dr. Howard Zinn's student, Joan Baez, the folk singer whose haunting melodies became a soundtrack to resistance. She refused to pay war taxes, helped organize nonviolent protest trainings, and co-founded the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence. Others, like Cora Weiss and Barbara Deming, used their platforms to call for peace, justice, and women's equality. These women endured arrests, public scorn, and FBI surveillance, yet they never stopped speaking. Some were mothers of draftees, others were teachers, artists, or ordinary citizens whose conscience refused to stay silent. They fought with petitions, with protests, with poetry. They disrupted draft boards, marched by the thousands, and changed public opinion. Not just about the war, but about the power of women to shape history. By the early 1970s, their efforts, along with those of countless others, helped pressure the government to end the draft and wind down U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Their names may not be etched in stone, but their courage echoes in every protester who dares to speak truth to power. These women didn't wear medals. They wore resistance like armor, and their voices still ring out today. While some women raised their voices in protest back home, others walked straight into the war, not with weapons, but with bandages, not to fight, but to heal. These were the caregivers and healers, the quiet heroines who held shattered bodies and whispered hope into ears fading with pain.
From the dusty triage tents of Da Nang to the surgical wards of Chu Lai, thousands of women served as military nurses, civilian medics, and Red Cross volunteers. Though their uniforms lacked brass and rank, they wore the weight of war in every wound they cleaned and every life they tried to save. Some were stationed within miles of combat, where the sound of mortars and helicopters was constant. For many, it was their first time away from home, fresh out of nursing school, sent into a war they barely understood. But their purpose was clear: save as many as possible, comfort those they couldn't.
And break they did. These women saw horrors that etched into memory: young men with missing limbs, burned victims crying out for mothers, the quiet stillness of those they couldn't save. Yet they rarely had the luxury to mourn. There were always more patients, always another helicopter. Beyond the battlefield, there were Vietnamese women too, doctors, nurses, traditional healers, who risked their lives tending to both civilians and soldiers. In the dense jungle, some patched wounds with herbs and care, hidden from air raids and advancing forces. Others worked in underground clinics or smuggled medicine to wounded fighters. They were not always trained professionals, but they became experts out of necessity, and in both the North and South, they were often the only source of aid in remote villages ravaged by war. Back in America, returning military nurses received little recognition. Unlike soldiers, many were not given the benefits of veteran status. Their trauma, like their service, was often invisible. But slowly, their stories have begun to surface. They didn't fight with bullets, but with gauze and grace. In a war measured by loss, they gave the gift of life, or at least a little more time. And while their work often went unseen, its impact was immeasurable. Dearest John, the garden has begun to bloom again, and I think of you every morning as I tend to the roses. In every war, messages are the threads that keep hope alive. But behind those letters, telegrams, and phone calls were the quiet women who became the custodians of emotion, history, and memory. These were the messengers and memory keepers. Across small towns and busy cities, women took on the emotional weight of communication. They worked in post offices, typed telegrams, and hand-delivered military notices. Some were the first to know that a son would never return, tasked with the cruel duty of delivering that truth with trembling hands and tearful eyes. Others wrote tirelessly, wives and sweethearts, mothers and daughters, composing daily letters that stitched love and longing into every line. In the absence of their voices, ink became the bond. They wrote through silence, fear, and months of uncertainty. The baby took his first step today. I wish you could have seen it. In military hospitals, some women volunteered to write letters for wounded soldiers who could no longer hold a pen. Others became unofficial historians, keeping journals, documenting stories, and photographing the war's impact on families and towns back home. These women didn't carry rifles, but they carried memory, preserving the lives that might otherwise have been forgotten. They documented joy in the face of despair and clung to routine as a form of resistance. Some kept every letter, every newspaper clipping, every telegram, binding the chaos of war into tangible memory. And while others fought on battlefields, these women fought for remembrance. They also bore the invisible burden of grief. A widow reading a letter that arrived days after her husband's death. A sister holding the last postcard from a brother lost in the jungle. A mother keeping her son's boots by the door, just in case.
Even after the shooting stopped, I kept writing to him. It was the only way I knew how to keep him alive.
Their messages outlived the war. Today, those letters are artifacts in museums, the voices of a generation frozen in time. They remind us not just of what happened, but of how it felt. They are history written in cursive, archived in love, and inked with sacrifice.